Welcome to another Swapcast of the Around the Empire and Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I'm the host of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast, Kyle Lansloan.
I'm the host of the Around the Empire podcast, Joanne Leon.
All right, so on the Swapcast today, me and Joanne wanted to, we got a couple things to talk about. The coronavirus outbreak is absolutely the top media story. And pretty much every time I talk to Joanne, she's one of the most well-researched people on the topics we have to talk about. And that's certainly the case with the coronavirus. So I'm very interested, in listening to Joanne's opinions on this. And I have a couple questions actually about it. And so hopefully we'll have a good discussion there. But, the main focus of the topic, and, I think this kind of matches with, how me and Joanne have picked topics for our shows over the years is, American foreign policy and the worst things going on in the world. And that's Yemen, as this week we passed the 5th anniversary of the U.S. War aligned with Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the people of Yemen there. So extremely important, I think topic to take the time to talk about. Amid all the coronavirus talk, because, as we'll talk about, if coronavirus gets to Yemen, it's going to wreak absolute havoc. And we'll explain to you how basically the U.S. made that possible in the war over the past couple of years. Joanne, do you have anything to add there?
I think that it's these two topics coincide well today, because not only are we've now had the 5th year anniversary of this conflict in Yemen, but just today I saw on Financial Times that they have agreed to another ceasefire to try to prevent the coronavirus outbreak, because I guess the ceasefire had been going along somewhat well at the beginning of the year. There was some praise about the fact that it had held up to some extent, but then just 2 months later, I guess just in February, there was a big escalation again. So, which is a good thing. I think they are taking this opportunity to, try to really make a ceasefire stick, or preferably some kind of a peace plan, and end the war altogether. So the two topics really do converge today. And so I think it was a good choice, Kyle.
All right. Well, I want to start off with just kind of a short history of how we got here in Yemen. I'm going to try to do this fairly quickly. Me and Joanne both have done shows about the Yemen war that will go into far greater detail than what we will on today's show. And so, Joanne, I was thinking about linking to your episode with Asa Bloomy, and I'll link to one of my that I think I described the Yemen war the best. And so we will have those linked in the show notes. And Joanne, if you have any other shows on Yemen, obviously just send those over. We'll put those in there.
Yeah, I mean, just if anyone's interested in getting a little more deep, I have a few interviews with Issa Bloomy, who's written a book on Yemen. I have a more recent interview with Shireen Al-Adimi, who is a Yemeni American and an activist. And also I have a couple of interviews with someone from Yemen who provide a little bit more color and interesting information. So yeah, I've got a bunch of them there.
Right. So to kind of where I want to start the timeline is in 2011, when the Arab Spring reaches Yemen, and the longtime dictator of Yemen is injured in an assassination attempt and is forced to leave the country. And so this is a country like Libya, like Egypt, where the Arab Spring is actually able to result in an overthrow of the leader. Now, you kind of had Tunisia, which was first, where the leader there was overthrown and the people actually were able to have something of a genuine uprising. But in Yemen, the U.S. State Department, led by Hillary Clinton, gets involved. And in 2012, they organize a one-man election and declare democracy in Yemen. The man who was elected is Mansour Hadi, and to this day, that is the only time he has been in any way recognized as a leader of Yemen by the Yemeni people, and has spent most of his time living in exile in Saudi Arabia. So Hadi's first 2 years of rule, he basically pits on and excludes a particular group a minority of the Yemeni population, and that is the Shia people, and they are known by their particular set, the Zaydis. And so after 2 year, or I guess 2 years too much of Hadi, they've asked, he the election mandate that he had expired by some time. They start a war against Hadi, who is at that point the leader of Yemen, and start attacking him. And then they're able to take the capital city of Yemen, and actually allied with the former ruler of Yemen, who was injured again in the assassination attempt and forced to flee the country, Salah. Yemen, not like the United States, when Salah comes back, a lot of the army just joins him. They don't care about the election. And so with that, Houthi Salah power, they're actually able to take a large portion of the country, and we're really threatening to take all major cities by the time we get to March of 2015. In Saudi Arabia, there's a new Deputy Crown Prince and Defense Minister, Mohammed bin Salman, will go by the initials MBS, decides that he wants to launch Operation Decisive Storm to basically take back Yemen from the Houthis. Now, at the time, what Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis say is that the Houthis, since they're Shia, are backed by Iran. Doesn't seem to be the case. Joanne, I know this is something that you've talked about a little bit on your show, but throughout this war, allegations that the Houthis are armed and supported by Iran. But that definitely didn't seem to be the case, maybe up until 2019. And even then, it's shaky how much support this group is getting from the Iranians.
Yeah, that, any knowledgeable person who I talked to said they are not what they're portrayed as. They're portrayed as Iranian proxies, and it's not that Iran didn't provide some kind of, moral support. And from what I heard, maybe through email advice and things like that, through communications. But yeah, it wasn't until the war between the U.S. and Iran really started to escalate that I think that they started to provide more direct support. That's my understanding.
I think one really important aspect of this, Joanne, is how the media has consistently covered the Yemen war over these 5 years. While people who have followed the Yemen war have seen the nuances that has gone on in that country, and how over time it seemed like the geopolitical situation created by the United States and Saudi Arabia in Yemen made it more and more likely that the Houthis and the Iranians would have common interest and decide to be more supportive of each other. But yet, from the very first day of this, every single news piece, and this is true up until today, calls this a proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians that's playing out in Yemen, and the Houthis are nothing more than an Iranian proxy force.
Yeah, that's not what I understood it to be. In fact, Issa Bloomy probably did portray it more as an act of desperation from the Saudis, who were running out of oil, running out of resources, and there's also a rivalry between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, even though the two rule. I'm just going to say that MBS is the ruler right now. He's technically not the king, but the king is pretty much incapacitated, and I think everybody knows that it's MBS that's running the country. So, MBS and then MBZ over in the UAE, they are supposedly friends and allies and all this stuff, but the underlying situation is that in Yemen anyway, shows that they really are not. Regardless of their personal relationship, the two countries are very much at odds. It's a rivalry and a conflict inside Yemen. So there's that complication that we didn't hear a whole lot about that. Issa Bloomy told me about it maybe 2 years ago before, and I did not see really much in the way of mention of that. But now that's really coming out. Some people are sort of openly stating that the reason that the war can't end right now is because really of the conflict between and the rivalry between Saudi and UAE.
So to get back to the conflict now between Saudi and UAE, but how the United States got involved in supporting Saudi Arabia here. In 2015 in the U.S., the political situation, Obama was trying to get the nuclear deal passed, and just about every Republican was dead set against it. Even people who you would think might be a little bit better on this issue, like Rand Paul, were making a lot of noise about it. So it was admittedly a difficult political situation for Obama, but he made the choice that he has absolutely no excuse for, and you find this in the New York Times, where the Obama administration says that they end up supporting Saudi Arabia's war effort here to placate the Saudis who were upset over making the nuclear deal with Iran. And so, just keep that in mind as we approach the 5th anniversary of this war. And Donald Trump in 2018 essentially killed the nuclear deal, and just how dark this war is now that we're continuing it, even though the nuclear deal that we started to placate Saudi Arabia for has died. So, after the Saudis get involved, they're able to push the Houthi Saleh coalition back in a couple of places. But generally speaking, the battle lines kind of set where they are, and that's where they remain today. There's been some territorial changes, especially in the more rural areas of Yemen. But, overall, things have remained the same. One thing that happens around this time is that taking advantage of, I guess, the political instability in Yemen, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, and local ISIS affiliates are able to seize a couple of cities. And there they essentially kind of have good deals with the UAE. Eventually, they take a whole bunch of money from the UAE to leave the city. And it's known that the UAE was running torture prisons, ones that, would literally roast people on a spit. In southern Yemen at this time. So, that's the USA side of the war that we're talking about here. And just one of the very interesting aspects, in 2014, you had the United States actually willing to target AQAP allied with the Houthis, and the Pentagon didn't see any problem as using the Houthis and supporting the Houthis in exchange for fighting against Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But AQAP, who, Joanne, they're the enemies of you and me. If there are people in this world who want to kill random Americans, as blowback terrorism, then, these are those guys. And yet they seem the ones that have, maybe have benefited most from this entire war effort.
Yeah.
As maybe the Iranians in, again, a very dark sense, but, have also been benefited. But, the war against AQAP is pretty much a completely separate aspect than the war we're talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that, and technically this is a 5th anniversary, but I think that Obama, when he came into office, I think bombing Yemen was one of the first things that he did. But yeah, also about the people who have, whatever group has benefited the most from this. I think you're right. I think it is AQAP. And we should also mention that I don't know if it's still the case. It probably shouldn't still be the case. But the most dangerous branch of Al Qaeda was considered to be AQAP. So Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So that's not just a small thing. It's a very big thing. Of course, now they are. I'm not going to get off track here, but I'll just mention that Al Qaeda is now very strong in Syria as well, and they have been over the past however long that war has been going, roughly the same time frame. But yeah, I agree. They made out pretty well, and God only knows how much money and other things they've gotten along the way.
Yeah. So, Joanne, on today's show, we only have time to talk about the Al Qaeda safe haven the U.S. created in Yemen. The one in Syria is a whole nother show.
Yeah.
So I will say that one part of this kind of particular war against AQAP that happens a little bit down the road in Yemen, but it is something that got a lot of media attention, was right the second day, I believe, of the Trump administration. The Navy SEALs carried out a raid in Yemen on a village. They say AQAP was present. Turns out really, not the case. Maybe they're passing through at some point, but they raid this village. The villagers actually think the Houthis are coming in, and so they, fire back against the Americans. And an 8-year-old girl who happens to actually be an American citizen gets shot in the neck and bleeds out in her grandmother's arms. And so, just talking about how much damage is done in Yemen that I'm going to do in a second in the war against the Houthis. Understand the U.S. is still waging another drone war, special operations war in Yemen against the terrorist forces there and catching up a whole bunch of civilians in the killing. But to shift back to, the U.S. Saudi UAE war against the Houthis, one of the, things that you have happening in the early days of the war is Saudi just bombing everything. We're talking about farms. We're talking about the flocks of sheep, the cranes at key ports. They bombed water treatment facilities, cereal factories, schools, soccer stadiums, roads, bridges. At one point, this bombing gets so bad, Will Porter talked to a Yemeni who Will's a friend of ours, who's a reporter over at RT, and explained to and relayed this story to me that for the situation in Yemen, maybe the hospital is an hour away, but then you have a situation where one road's bombed and then there's a checkpoint, so now it's 2 hours away, but that hospital gets bombed, so the one you have to go to is 4 hours away, but then a bridge is destroyed and it takes 8 to I think he goes up to like 20 hours to get to the hospital. And then at the same time there's fuel shortages and everything else in Yemen. So Martha Moody describes what Saudi Arabia did here as waging a food war against the Yemeni people. And this happens early in the war, and it really just continues all the way up through. And now the humanitarian situation is absolutely catastrophic. Joanne, I think you have some recent numbers. Do you want to talk about how bad the humanitarian situation has gotten?
Let's see. I've got a thread here. Are you talking about the thread that Shireen provided with the infographics? Yeah. So she's put some good infographics in here. One of them just talks about, the complexity of the war. But there's one here that says over 80% of the population is in need of humanitarian aid. 16.4 million lack access to health care. Millions lack access to fuel. The worst cholera outbreak in modern history was there, 2 million people. Over 3 million are displaced internally. 24.3 million, 90%, lack access to electricity. 19 million lack access to water. Over 100,000 were killed. I think everyone pretty much agrees that number is probably low. And at least 85,000 children under the age of 5 died of hunger and disease.
Right. So that 100,000 number is the number by ACLED. And this is a group who does very important work actually going in war zones and trying to verify that people were killed. And so I believe that 100,000 number is, number of bodies and names that they have. It is not saying that this is comprehensive. We know that 100,000 people have died in this war because a lot of people have, been driving between two towns in Yemen. We have, cases of a funeral being bombed, wedding parties. I guess a tradition in Yemen is like the wedding party starts at the bride's family and then walks to the groom's family's village or whatever. And so in the process there, you have a bunch of people walking together. Well, several times Saudi Arabia has bombed these things.
Yeah.
And, just absolutely catastrophic. And so, all those people probably weren't counted. And certainly all the children who have starved to death and the people who have died of cholera or diphtheria or any of the other, very serious issues that, Yemen's dealing with. Over the years there, we've had cholera outbreak, but generally just waterborne illnesses in Yemen. It's like 1 million people a year are getting these waterborne illnesses. Thousands of people are dying from them. And this is something that shouldn't happen in the world. It really shouldn't be that you're having a cholera epidemic. And unfortunately, so much of this, and maybe we could take a second to talk about the blockade of Yemen, is that, this entire time, despite bombing all the infrastructure, they also haven't allowed anything to come back into the country.
Yeah. And I think I should just mention, too, that Scott Horton just did an interview with someone from Oxfam. And one of the interesting details was, well, of course we know that infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, we're talking about, water transportation, water purification, sewage, this kind of thing. Um, I believe it's a war crime to bomb that infrastructure, but that's been done, all along. And basically, the massive cholera outbreak, if they could just have a functioning water system, that it doesn't really even require a lot of health care or lots of medicines. If they could just have decent water, that problem would clear up by itself. So, I don't know if I'm getting across just I don't know. I think that's a profound statement. And just the fact that so many war crimes have been committed here, but just the basic access to clean water, these people are trapped. And I guess this is a good time to talk about the blockade, because another thing that a lot of people don't know, I mean, there is humanitarian aid getting in, there are some things getting in, but our Navy is helping to enforce that blockade. And that's, part of our participation in it that really hardly anybody ever talks about that. Unless maybe I'm wrong on that, Kyle, but that's my impression.
No, it seems to absolutely be the case. I haven't seen like the Navy say, "Yeah, we're enforcing a blockade of Yemen," and of course they don't admit it's a blockade. What I guess in a very literal sense, it's an extremely tedious, rigorous, and intentionally disruptive inspections process where, let's say, a ship wants to get into Yemen, whether it's in Houthi or government controlled territory, they have to go through like inspections in Saudi Arabia. I think they have to go all the way up to the Jeddah port there, which is fairly far away. And then they have to go back. And sometimes they make people go through this process 2 or 3 times. And so, these are the rites of passage that are enforced in the area. And the U.S. says, they're following whatever, rules are in place in the area, and I assume that means that they're following along with their Saudi allies' rules. I do want to mention that this blockade has extended all the way to preventing ships that have medical supplies on them, like chlorine tablets, from entering the country. And at this point, it's extremely difficult to be a Yemeni with any kind of long-term illness like diabetes or cancer, just because it's very hard to get the medication into that country. And so when you hear the numbers that Joanne brought up about how bad the humanitarian situation is, it almost seems unbelievable that 90% of the population would need humanitarian assistance, because, like, let's face it, nobody is cruel enough to put a civilian population in that position. But that's exactly what happened here. It's been an intentional war led by Saudi Arabia, but even in the, on the moral terms, I think me and Joanne both agree that war crimes were committed by the U.S., both under the U.S. and the Obama administrations, by supporting this war. At one point, mid-air refueling was going on, but now even logistics, intelligence support, supporting the blockade. These are all clearly war crimes. But by actually providing the intelligence and logistical support for Saudi Arabia, I think that's, like, in an international legal sense, actually opens the U.S. up for war crime, prosecutions or something.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that their command and control centers and their intelligence rooms include Americans. So I don't see how they could dodge that responsibility, at least in aiding and abetting, at the very least, in war crimes.
Now, there's one other aspect, like kind of politics that happened in Yemen that's really aided the humanitarian crisis. One thing that Nasser Arabi has told Scott Horton several times is that there is food at the markets for the people of Yemen, but people are very poor. And he's pointed out that during the first couple of years of this war in Yemen, the central bank was located in Sana'a and paid the salaries of everyone in the country. Because it was a country where it's heavily central government pays most people to do most jobs. Well, once that central bank got shifted by Hadi in Saudi Arabia to Aden, they stopped paying a lot of people in northern Yemen their salaries, and so now there's a lot of people there who don't have money. one thing I just want, we talk about northern Yemen and southern Yemen. That's not, not exactly on a map. If you look at the territory controls, it's not
Yeah.
split right down the middle. But northern Yemen is generally what's called, and I think that's about 80% of the Yemeni population that lives under Houthi control, and then it's about 20% that live under the Saudi control area. Although geographically, the Saudi controlled territory is much larger.
Yeah, that looks about right from the map I'm looking at. Yeah, it's really east and west Yemen, but they call it north and south. Um, I was just going to mention something else too, and it has slipped my mind for the moment because, um,
All right. Well,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah. So another event we should talk about is that in December of 2017, Salah and Houthi, who were in an alliance together, that actually splits and breaks down, and Salah agrees to turn back to the Saudi side. And the Houthis ended up killing him and essentially consolidated all that power and territory under their control. I think there was a lot of questions if that would happen and who would go, with Saudi Arabia, but it seems like generally the Houthis have been able to maintain that territory. And like I said, this happens in the middle of the war. Territory between now and the beginning has not changed very much.
Yeah, and also just to go back just a little bit, the Hadi overthrow by the Houthis when the Houthis came into Sana'a, there was extensive work by one of our envoys on a power sharing deal, and they had actually reached a deal where the Houthis actually didn't want to run the country supposedly. They just wanted to be, they wanted a participatory government. And just when they had that deal, they were on the brink of sort of bringing that deal to fruition. That's when MBS started bombing too. So I just wanted to mention that point. I thought it was important. But sorry, back to
Yeah.
2017. Yeah.
No, and so I think from 2017 on, there's not too many like big updates to have. Essentially, the town of Hadada, which is the key port city in Yemen, has been contested between the Houthis and the Saudi bad side. I don't think a lot of territory has changed there. There's been on and off ceasefires. There's always shaky. There's always violations. Unfortunately, this is a really populated area, and it's an area that brings in a lot of the humanitarian aid. The port in Aden is absolutely a mess. A couple days ago, you had a group of people come in and fire off shots in the port to ward off a diesel fuel ship, supposedly, and so. This is where goods are coming in, and yeah, it's the main battlefront in this war. So it's been a very tense few years. The killing hasn't stopped, the bombing hasn't stopped. The Houthis, for their part, are certainly using indiscriminate tactics like landmines. They've used soldiers in this war who are under the age of 18. So child soldiers and stuff like that. Problematic practices on both sides of this war, but clearly the Saudi war machine is the by far the most superior fighting force, although unable to take territory, and has just inflicted a massive toll on the civilian population. So maybe, Joanne, this is a good time to talk about how within this very complicated war in Yemen, where you have the war against the Houthis, the war against AQAP, you also have a split between the Saudi-backed government in southern Yemen, where there's been some pretty significant fighting between the Saudis, the UAE, and their proxy forces in Yemen.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated how these things, who aligns with who, and it's also always changing because there are different political groups or tribal groups who, they work for money, a lot of them, and others just, there are shifting alliances, let's just put it that way. But the one aspect that was hidden for a long time, this was always portrayed as a Saudi UAE coalition. They were cooperating, they were fighting together against the Houthis and, ostensibly to keep Hadi in power. So it turns out, and I've been told by Issa Bloomy a long time ago that really wasn't the case. Inside Yemen, there was a rivalry between the Saudis and the UAE, even though MBS and MBZ have a good personal relationship. that doesn't carry through to the countries as a whole and how they operate in Yemen. Um, to get into it would take too long to get into the details of that. But one thing that I did notice is that over time there was hinting about, like, you never used to hear anything about the Saudis and the UAE actually being at odds in Yemen. There were weird things that happened, but it was never quite explained. We started to get a bit of information about it, I would say a little more than a year ago. But I noticed today that in an article about the Guardian, an article in the Guardian, that they are flat. They're talking about it very openly. And not only are they talking about this clash, rivalry, conflict between the UAE and the Saudi interests in Yemen, they're literally blaming this aspect of the conflict for the breakdown in ceasefires and in the inability to end this war. And I can probably find a quote on that. Let me just pull out a couple of little quotes from some people in this Guardian article. The Saudis, struggling with their limited military capabilities and financial strain of the conflict, have engaged with the Houthis in a back channel talks facilitated by Oman. This is recently. And it's believed that the Emiratis, who back Yemen's new chief of staff, Lieutenant General Sagir bin Aziz, pushed for the offensive. They're talking about a recent flare-up in a town where there are a lot of oil and gas resources called Marib. They say that it was actually the Emiratis who pushed for the offensive, in part to curb the ambition of Saudi-backed clients. And here's the one that I thought was really important. It's no secret at this point that in Yemen, Saudi Arabia only cares about securing its borders. What gets underestimated is how high the level of antagonism is between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, particularly when it comes to support for Islah, which is a party that you mentioned earlier. So they're actually blaming these two countries and their inability to come to some kind of agreement among themselves as the reason why no progress can be made on ending the war in Yemen. So I'm hoping personally that this aspect of the war gets more attention, because apparently it's a core issue, and I think it's about time that it is spoken about out in the open.
Absolutely. I guess the last big issue I want to bring up here, Joanna, if you have anything left, we could add on that. And I know there's so much of the Yemen story we haven't talked about today. And like I said, I think we would need like shows and shows to cover all. I mean, at one point, the UAE was hiring a bunch of former U.S. Special Operations soldiers to go carry out political assassinations against their political rivals. The stories that come out of this war are so insane and are just so revealing of the crimes of the empire, and they're such unbelievable crimes that I think one of the reasons that it's hard to talk about Yemen and so many people don't talk about it is because it's just like, we've told you all the horrific things that are going on in Yemen and the U.S. role in it. You just feel bad. And so I do want to stop to point out that talking about this war and trying to expose it over these 5 years, while certainly hasn't been successful enough. And Joanne, I just think to myself that every person who learns about this conflict is instantly going to be like, well, the U.S. needs to get the hell out. There has been a growing movement in Congress that's been growing in the amount of success that they've had over these years. And while it hasn't been very fast gains, they have amounted to something significant, where at first, it's Rand Paul, Chris Murphy, and Mike Lee, maybe Bernie Sanders too, try to block one arms sale to Saudi Arabia of, the literal bombs that will blow Yemeni children to pieces, and only getting like 3 votes in the Senate on that, to the point where in the past year we've had different authorizations and war authorization bills introduced in both the House and Senate that invoke the War Powers Act to say that Donald Trump needs to end the U.S. involvement in this war. One of these actually passed both houses of Congress, but it was done so in a way that allowed a presidential veto. And so I read the Constitution when I was in 11th, or I think 10th or 11th grade. And in there, I guess I missed a section that says a president could start any war he wants, and then if Congress could get 2/3 majority in each house to override a veto, then the war could end. And so, because that's apparently the rules that we're playing by.
Yeah, apparently. Yeah, and I think that was a particularly stupid move by Trump because he kind of made it his war, whereas before he could have like ended it and said, "Hey, I didn't start this. I want out of this." And I think he actually even sort of expressed sentiments like that in the beginning, but after he vetoed, it's his. He owns it now. I had two other real quick points I wanted to mention if now's a good time. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so toward the end of the Obama administration, things had gotten so bad that they actually had to deal with sort of a scandal. There were some leaks that came out that said his State Department was, very worried about our role in this, to the point where Obama actually supposedly reduced our role. It was mostly a technicality. We were still doing, but he did do some type of reduction. So, they were already to the point. That would have been the perfect time to ramp it down, but that didn't happen. The other couple really big sort of milestones, there have been numerous talks and efforts for either truces or ceasefires or peace talks. They've all failed. There were a lot around the Hodeidah port, and there, like I had mentioned, there's one that kind of held. It at least, let's just say, it at least improved the situation a little bit. And even up to the beginning of this year, there was some praise for the fact that that ceasefire had done good. Let's put it that way. But after that, just I think in February, there was another big escalation, and it centers around this town called Marib, which is oil and gas rich, and it totally backfired. I guess we don't have enough time to go into the details of it, but the Houthis ended up doing a counterattack, and it really ended up going badly for the Saudis and the Emiratis. But the other really big thing I think that we should mention is just this past September, the Houthis and their missile capabilities. We're still talking about the old Yemeni army, at least some aspect of them, and their engineering center and old refitted missiles. And it's a controversial topic as to what kinds of missiles these were and where they came from. But we had the major sort of game changer where the Houthis did a major attack on the Saudis. This got blamed on Iran. Our intelligence agencies claimed that it was Iran. It wasn't the Houthis, but there's a lot of evidence that it was the Houthis. Basically crippled a major Saudi oil facility. And that really was a game changer. And another thing mentioned in that Guardian article that I had brought up, after that oil facility attack, the Saudis started a back channel negotiations with the Houthis, because not only were they worried about more attacks on their airports and that major oil facility, but it's also a very squishy border area there. And the Houthis and other, I guess you could call them militias, there's a mix in the population, and there are militias that fight in those areas. And there were points in time when they won some significant battles. They took hundreds of prisoners. They got they had footage of destroying or even capturing. At one point, they captured a whole bunch of Saudi military vehicles. So, that was a real turning point in this war. It didn't end the war, but I think it did change the nature of it, and maybe, as this Guardian article sort of implied, changed the Saudis' objectives in this war, because now they're defending their own border. And they're at great risk. So I just want to make sure we brought that part up.
That's a really important point, because along with the pressure in Congress, that seems to be about the only thing that makes the Saudis at all interested in talking to the Houthis. Mohammed bin Salman seems fairly content with killing Houthis, or not, I mean Yemenis, just as long as it takes to win this war, and that really the only barrier at this point is that the Houthis could fight back, and the United States may withdraw their support at some point because this thing is just getting too ugly. But let's see, I had a show this week, Joanne. Actually, it was my previous show where I had on a war vet who is also, currently an ER nurse, and so I thought he would have a, kind of a unique perspective on like what, this would look like in a war zone. And while he wasn't in Yemen himself, he did, feel able to, comment on like the medical facilities we have in the U.S. versus what they're going to have in a place like Yemen, and just how much havoc this is going to, wreak
Yeah.
if it comes to Yemen and it's an outbreak. And just judging by what's happened in the U.S., and the cholera outbreak in Yemen, my assumption is that it's going to be really bad in Yemen. I really hope I don't understand something and that's not going to be the case. But I don't know. Tell me a little bit about the coronavirus here, Joanne. I know that you've really like looked into and dug into the numbers, and so I know we don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but at the same time, I am interested to hearing what you think just about the coronavirus in general. And I know that we don't have any specific data on Yemen or anything, but maybe just specific to you, kind of like what this virus means.
Yeah, sure. And it's a good transition because there's one sort of little silver lining in the coronavirus in that it was an impetus for another major push for a ceasefire and an end to this war in Yemen. Because, like you said, the conditions there, they're ripe for just basically rampaging through this country. Again, that Oxfam guy who was talking to Scott Horton said that in a hospital in the Yemen, this is before coronavirus, right? This is pre-coronavirus. If you go in a hospital there, what you'll see is you'll see a hospital bed with a whole family in it, two adults sharing one hospital bed and the children in these beds. You'll see people who don't have a bed at all. They're being treated in from a chair or on a floor. And of course, the blockade, just imagine we have trouble having the right equipment for what we need here in the United States. Just imagine what it's like over there. So there is a major effort, and as of today, it looks like there's been a little progress on that. And basically, everybody's afraid for not only for the Yemenis, but people who are in that basic area. Now suddenly you're worried about countries that are your neighbors, because if it's raging in your neighboring country, it's inevitably going to come to you. So there is that aspect of it. Now, as far as the virus itself, I'm not a medical expert or anything like that. I could just tell you, I started to pay attention to it when it was raging in China, and I sort of had my eye on it. But when it moved to Europe is when I realized, it was going to come here. And so, I warned my kids and I started getting some of the, just getting some supplies into the house and all of that. And that really wasn't that long. That was about a month ago. And I started looking at the numbers here in New Jersey. Now, for people who aren't, I live in the Philadelphia metro area, though I'm in the state of New Jersey. I'm in the southwestern part of it. The state of New Jersey is particularly vulnerable because the two major population centers in this state are metro areas of some of the biggest cities in the country. The biggest city in the country, by far, New York City. A large area of northern New Jersey is part of the New York metro area. It really, there's a state line, but other than that, it's really metro areas. And then down in the southwestern part of the state, the other population center is the Philadelphia metro area. So it became clear about a week ago that New York was going to have a big problem, and that, as a result, inevitably, so is North Jersey. So I did start tracking some numbers there. The first numbers I wrote down they were really only doing a little bit of testing, in the hundreds. And that was Sunday, March 15th, not very long ago. And at that point in time, we had 98 positive tests, and we had our first deaths. We had 2 deaths at that point in time. 1 week ago, so Thursday, March 19th, we've started to increase the number of tests. We had 742 positive tests and 9 deaths. So it's still pretty manageable. Now this week, this is 1 week later, we have ramped up the testing significantly. There are some drive-through or drive-in testing centers, and we have some commercial labs now involved in it. So the testing is really ramped up. We have 6,876 positive cases, 13,661 negative results. We now have that number, but we have 81 deaths. So we went from 9 to 81, 9 squared, 81 in 1 week. Now I'm really starting to get worried, even though I'm in much better shape than the people in North Jersey. If you look at a heat map, you can see that the big problem is really in the New York City metro area. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 beds, hospital beds, and I don't recall the number of ICU, but I think New York State. Well, New York is a very large state, but they only have 53,000 hospital beds and 3,000 ICU critical care units for the entire state. The metro area itself is somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 million people. So you can see, I won't even get into the failures of our healthcare system, but that's a serious problem. No matter what you think about this whole thing, the economic consequences, the way it's being handled, this is really spreading, and it's spreading quickly. Hopefully, we're somewhere near the peak, and it'll go down. Some people say that we are about 12 days, so roughly 2 weeks behind Italy. Italy, it was believed that they had hit their peak and the numbers had started to go down, but the next day it was only a 1-day decrease, and then the next day they were up again. So, maybe they're at a plateau of sorts, but they're not on the downward trend yet. And if we are 2 weeks behind them, if this is a fairly accurate way to view it, then we're going to still be trending up for a couple more weeks at least. The entire country, there are, do I have the right numbers here? 83,507 positive cases, Kyle, and 1,201.
Probably within the past hour and a half of us recording this, Joanne, the U.S. surpassed both Italy and China for most cases. And, I will say that number is just of whatever, positive testing that they've confirmed. And I know that, here and there they're not testing, and here they're testing a lot. And so for that reason, the numbers look all different. But, I think, the thing that I really didn't understand the first time I talked about this coronavirus outbreak, and that I've come to appreciate and what, understand is critical, it comes down to the number of hospital beds versus the people that need them. And so, that's why, the people were predicting that, this would cause death. Although I will say that, the impression that I got from the mainstream media, Joanne, was that, like, I saw this on Twitter, and, this is the vibe I felt from people, was that, like a couple weeks ago, you're in a room with your coworkers, and that you're going to come back in a couple weeks and not everybody's going to be there. You know what I mean? That this thing is going to, like, hit a significant portion of the population. And so while I continue to think, like, we're not looking at, the millions and the very scary numbers that have been put out there. This is going to cause significant disruptions for the country for the coming weeks, and it is going to kill thousands and thousands of Americans.
There's another thing that is maybe a positive. When people were estimating that we were 12 days or 2 weeks behind Italy, since then, I think that, I don't know if that still holds, and I'll tell you why. When the outbreak really started to explode in New York City, they still weren't testing a lot and things like that, but they're now saying, and they're saying this during the president does a daily briefing with several members of his administration or along there with him, one of them being a doctor, or a couple of them being a doctor, but the one potentially Dr. Burks, the female blonde-haired older woman. They're even admitting that this has been probably going around in New York for much longer, and they've mentioned numbers like 4 to 6 weeks. So if that's the case, then maybe we are not that far behind Italy, and maybe we don't have 2 weeks of Italy-like conditions or trends in our future. I'm kind of hoping that, but and that doesn't surprise me. For anyone who ever been to New York City, what a diverse city that is, and how many people are going in and out of the country through New York City. They're just lots of people from other places. It's really kind of a place where you would expect the spread to happen. So, and then as far as just New Jersey has been pretty proactive for this. So I don't even know how many days we've actually been on quote unquote lockdown, a shelter in place, but they've sort of eased some restrictions in the past like 2 weeks. First they started with voluntary things like restaurants. My son is a college student and works at a restaurant. They switched to all takeout. Spring break had coincided with this, so they were going on spring break anyway. They've extended it, and then they said all online classes. The schools are closed, and I guess it's been, I don't know, I don't think it's even been a week since we've been with mandatory closures of all businesses except essential businesses. You can still travel. I had not left the house in a number of days until last night. Just to give you an idea what it's like around here, I had to go to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription, and I wanted to get some milk. So it was about 8:30 at night, and there are very few cars on the road. It's like a ghost town. I live near a very busy train station, and there was a scattering of cars in the train station parking lot. Now it was night anyway, so there aren't all that many there, but it was significantly less. I went into the CVS, and of course I have some like food service level gloves, so I use those. And you go up to the pharmacy, and they have these big tables, so you can't even walk up to the counter. They have put tables there, so you can only get like within maybe 3 feet of the person on the other side of the counter. They have like all kinds of signs up saying just different restrictions that people should stay at least 3 or 6 feet apart. That was weird. I think I was the only customer in the store, and then one other person came in before I left. And then I went to the convenience store where I was going to get some milk. There were, I think, 2 or 3 people there, and it's just very strange. It was very odd.
At your store, did they have the tape on the ground so like at this CVS I went to, they have it taped off so like where you should stand in line, and like all the spaces are like probably 3 or 4 feet away from each other.
I did not notice that because there was nobody there.
Okay.
But
yeah,
but there were tables in front of like the register so that you couldn't walk up to the counter. And they moved the like credit card swipers. They moved them out to the tables so that you didn't need to get close to them while you're paying. So yeah, it was just pretty weird. In the convenience store, they had like in the food service area, they have these touch screens where you order custom made sandwiches or whatever, and they had hand sanitizer there, and they ask people every time before you use the touch screen to sanitize your hands. I already had gloves on and stuff, so yeah, it was just real. But luckily I was still able to get milk, and the store is very close to me. But it's just very, very weird. It's just very weird. In some ways it's like normal because you can still get in your car and drive somewhere, but in other ways it's I was alive through a number of different wars in this country, through 9/11, and I've never seen anything like this in my life. Never. So it's quite jarring.
Strange times. That is definitely, the case here where, one thing I recently said to Pete Quinones when he was on my show, and something that he had brought up is, Joanne, just imagine with all the coverage and all the analytics done on coronavirus, just take one day of that and dedicate that to Yemen in the mainstream media.
Yeah, yeah.
And just, I guess, how far do you think we would get if, rather than writing stories about every single person that dies of coronavirus, they profile every single Yemeni children that starves, to death. That
Wow,
that I
that's
think.
quite an insight, Kyle. That really is. That's a perfect way to wrap this up too. But yeah, Yemen is a painful. It I have to admit I avoided this topic. I would avoid reading the articles about Yemen because it was so painful. And then I would force myself to do it, and then over time, more and more, I started talking to people and all that. But it's such a sad, difficult story. The temptation is to just, thank people for covering it and just do some token thing. But you have to force yourself to stay up on it. But yeah, if it even got, yeah, even the tiniest bit of coverage, percentage of coverage that this coronavirus thing is, I don't think you could find one American who'd be in favor. And I don't know. You would think that we could get out of it on that basis. Just a little bit more covered. So I think, I hate to tell people what to do. I hate, saying you should do this or you should do that. But kind of everybody owes it, I think, to the people in that country to just be a little bit more informed, and, talk to somebody else about it and, do what you can to get us out of this war. It's a horrible war. It's war crimes. It is a war crime in my view. And, maybe you can relate a little bit to what it's like to be in Yemen with the situation, just a tiny little bit because of this coronavirus pandemic.
All right, all right. Well, with that, everybody, be sure to check out both mine and Joanne's show. All my work is at the libertarianinstitute.org, and I write the shows there, and I write the daily news roundup on the website.
Yeah, just you can find everything at aroundtheempire.com. It's on all mobile podcast apps and such. But if you have any, also on YouTube. But everything's on the website aroundtheempire.com.
All right, thanks, Joanne. We'll have to do another one of these soon.
Okay, thanks, Kyle.